Good morning and welcome. I'm Chris Stewart. I'll be your MC this morning. I just ask that you'd silence your phones. I know we've got a number of other folks that are still waiting to arrive this morning, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I guess there's some real problems with the red line this morning. For those of you who have not attended an event, a BBG Gallup research series, we move pretty quick. We've got 5 speakers this morning. We'll hold questions to the end and allow for some questions and interaction at the end of the event. We're pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. We got a fantastic session for you this morning, the first nationwide study of Somalia. So we'll be sharing some of those findings, some great information from Mali, and then we're also going to be talking about the Sahel and whether there is truly a uniform Sahel in Africa. On December 11th, I just want to preview, we've got another event coming up as part of this Gallup BBG research series. We'll be focused on Vietnam, and that'll be December 11th at 9 a.m. here in the Great Hall. Let me begin by introducing Mr. Bruce Sherman, the Director of the Office of Strategy and Development for the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Bruce is responsible for global strategy and research for the BBG. He joined the BBG in 1996 after 12 years at Radio Marti, the broadcasting service for Cuba, including 5 years as the station's Deputy Director in charge of all daily operations. Mr. Sherman directs formulation and execution of BBG strategy, leading a team of senior managers and planners across all broadcast groups. He has overseen development of the 3 5-year strategic plans, including the most recent 2012 to 2016 plan, and is the principal author. He's also played a central role in launching new strategic initiatives for the Muslim world, including Radio Sawa and Al Hurra TV for the Middle East and Radio Farda for Iran. These and other strategic initiatives since 2002 have expanded the BBG's worldwide audience from 100 million to over 206 million today. He built and also directs the BBG's global media research program with quantitative and qualitative studies in some 70 countries around the world. The program is one of the most comprehensive media research efforts in the world. Sherman holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Florida and a master's degree in liberal arts from St. John's College. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Sherman.
Thank you, Chris. And in the interest of just moving ahead as quickly as possible, I think I'll just speak from where I'm sitting here. I'd also like to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. One of the members of our board, Michael Meehan, will join us in progress, and so we'll introduce Governor Meehan when he arrives. We're happy to resume this research briefing series with Gallup, and we look forward to a good discussion today. 3 quick notes just to frame the conversation, the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to my research colleagues. The first is that it's longer today than it typically is. We're going an hour and a half, but we will get you out of here right at 10:30. We're going longer because we're going to be covering 2 countries, talking about the Sahel in addition, data points on the Sahel. We are also including in this presentation, in a way that is new for us, attitudinal data points that come from the Gallup World Poll, in addition to the media data points that come from the BBG Gallup Media Studies. We think that's a very important development for us. We increasingly want to take a look at not only how our audiences use media, but what is on our audience's minds. The issues that matter most to them, their interests, as we try to look at the overall strategic context that we're operating in. So it's both looking at attitudes and media that we're intent on doing and that we'll be capturing in the presentation today. That said, what you'll see today is a subset of the information that we gather. The information that we gather, again, in the BBG Gallup Media Studies, and also the information that Gallup gathers in its World Poll. These are both massive projects that gather lots of relevant strategic information. What we've selected to present are points that we believe are very important for the purposes of looking at strategy, to driving our strategy. We are a research-driven organization at the BBG, and we inform our strategies all around the world, including in the important Sahel region, through our research initiatives. So again, it's a little bit longer than normal. Bear with us. I think we'll probably go 45 minutes or so in the presentation, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A. We're going to be covering attitudinal and media data, and we're going to be focusing on what we think are the most strategic points to try to crystallize the issues that we see in the region. So with that, Chris, I think I'll turn it back to you, and we'll get started. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Bruce. Our first presenter today is Dr. Rajesh Srinivasan, who's a regional research director with Gallup and the program manager for the current International Audience Research Program of the BBG. His work focuses on the Gallup World Poll, the largest available source of key world data, providing access to the voices, hearts, and minds of citizens in more than 160 countries and areas. In the largest undertaking of its kind, Gallup is measuring the well-being of the world's citizens for the next 100 years, continually polling a representative sample of 95% of the Earth's adult population. Dr. Srinivasan directs the World Poll in Asia and the Middle East, which includes oversight on sample design, developing customized instruments for the respective region, selecting and training vendors in individual countries, and coordinating the data collection effort across 35 countries. As the program manager on the International Audience Research Program, he leads a team of research professionals conducting over 70 projects worldwide. Dr. Srinivasan joined Gallup in 1993. Before joining the World Poll team in 2005, he spent more than 12 years consulting with corporate clients in the United States and India, focusing on customer acquisition and retention. He has worked with clients in industries such as banking, hospitality, telecommunications, healthcare, and education. He received his bachelor's degree in statistics from Loyola College in India and a doctorate in economics from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rajesh Srinivasan.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. My job here is to set the context for why we are focusing on Mali and Somalia. As Bruce pointed out, over the next 5 to 10 minutes, I will briefly walk you through what some of the interesting highlights that we picked up from the World Poll in the region called Sahel. This is a sort of a ethno-linguistic group map of what is called the Sahel. Typically, Sahel would be described as the transition zone. In topographic terms, is the transition zone between the arid Sahara Desert in the north and the savannas in the south. And it has the influence of both the sub-Saharan African sort of cultural and linguistic impact, as well as the North African influence of the ethnic tribes, language, as well as the religion. Over 10 to 15 different ethnic tribes are present in this particular part of the world, or the zone called Sahel, extending eastward from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to through Mauritania, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, into Chad, and some folks may say actually Somalia and Ethiopia could be considered to be part of Sahel as well. It's unique in terms of its heterogeneity of the ethnic groups, as well as the languages that it represents, which we will talk about a little later as one of the interesting sort of challenges that international broadcasters have to deal with. Sahel has been in the news lately for several different things, but most importantly, I think we picked out 4 things that we've all heard about. The first one is political instability. There have been numerous coups in the countries in the Sahel. 2008 coup in Mauritania, 2010 in Niger, and most recently 2012 coup in Mali. The second most important one that we have heard about, mentioned in the context of Sahel, is terrorism and transnational organized crime. The Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb seems to be very active in this particular region and has been involved, or purported to be involved in the takeover of some of the parts of Mali after the 2012 coup. Concomitant with that is the issue of radicalism and violent ideology. We will look at some of the data points that we picked up with regards to this shortly. And most importantly, food insecurity, particularly famine and drought, have been a very persistent problem across the region. Recently, Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, made this comment about how the international community has to come up with a unified framework to address some of these common problems and issues this region faces. Let's take a look at some of the key data points that we have picked up. And the key question we are asking here is Sahel really a homogeneous region, or are there multiple problems and multiple things that we're dealing with, and different trajectories that each of these countries in the Sahel region face that we need to contend with as in the context of coming up with a strategy to address these problems. Talking about food insecurity, very high levels of food insecurity across the region, as you can see. At least half of the people in every single country that we have looked at in this particular region talk about not having sufficient amount of money to buy food in the past 12 months. Likewise, over half of the people are struggling to make ends meet with the kind of income that they're making right now. 7 in 10 in Niger say that they did not have enough money for food. That's a substantial number of people in terms of millions of people. Not surprising, these are all 2012 data. Not surprising that the UN reported over 700,000 people were under severe stress of famine and drought this past year in Niger. Religion is an important element of the daily life of the average person living in this region. Over 90% of the people in every single country that we surveyed reported that to be true. However, when you talk about the influence of Islamic principles, as the relevance of Islamic principles and the incorporation of Islamic principles in the national legislation, we see quite a bit of difference in terms of attitudes towards that. What proportion of the people strongly support it as the only source of legislation, you see quite a bit of variance in it. All the way from 13%, only 13% of folks in Mali saying that they strongly support that should be a part of the legislation, to 43% in Senegal. And there are some interesting trends here too. Senegal and Mauritania actually have seen increases in these percentages over the last 2-3 years since we started measuring this, while Mali and Chad have actually seen declines. Niger has stayed steady at about 30-34% of the people saying they strongly support. They feel like Sharia should be one of the only source of legislation. Violent ideology, when you think about it, again, it's more prevalent in some countries than others across this region. The way we define violent ideology here is really thinking about attitudes towards two different things. One is sacrificing one's life for what they believe in, and the other one is about oppressed groups seeking peaceful resolution versus using violence to find resolution. Again, a few countries stand out significantly here. Over half of the people in Chad feel that sacrificing one's life for what they believe in is morally justified, which is very high compared to a country like Sudan with only about 18%. Not all of the data is coming from 2012 here because some of these measures were gathered perhaps in 2010. Consistently, a third of the people are saying that peaceful means alone may not work in most countries for oppressed groups to find resolution. Democratic values, if you were to think of that as representing freedom of expression, freedom of choice, and the confidence that people have in being able to choose the person to run their country, it varies quite a bit across the entire region. Senegal, if you look at it, stands out as a beacon here in terms of the confidence that people have in the honesty of elections. And one might ask, what is the case? Why did it happen? This was measured shortly after the elections in Senegal when the incumbent was removed and a new president took power. So clearly the individuals there feel that there is some hope in terms of how the institution of elections actually seem to be working there. Burkina Faso and Niger, about half of the people have confidence in elections, but on the other hand, if you look at Mauritania, which also had elections, it's substantially lower, only about 28% there, and Chad only about 10%. Freedom of life, if you think about it, generally people have freedom of life, but if you go back to the very first slide, when 7 out of 10 people are in poverty, what does freedom of life really mean in that context? Confidence in institutions, obviously for a stable region, we need institutions to be working efficiently and working well. and you see that there is quite a bit of variation across this region. Only 49% of the people have confidence in the national government in Mali, and 38% in Mauritania. And consistently, what you will see is the confidence in military is far greater than confidence in national government. It's not surprising that there have been that many coups, because most of the coups, at least the justification has been to replace an ineffective leadership, civilian leadership or whatever leadership, with something which is providing more stability for the population. Approval of country leadership has been declining in some of these countries, and particularly if you look at Chad and Mali. Mali in particular has declined from 70 to 47% just between 2011 and 2012, indicating again the stability, the political instability that we talked about early on. Interestingly, Senegal again has shown the increase in the approval of the performance of the leadership, which again goes to show that there is a tremendous amount of confidence in the new leadership of Senegal among the population there. The last slide here really is trying to reinforce that consistent with what we are seeing in the rest of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, approval of US leadership is very high, 7 in 10, over 7 in 10 consistently approve of US leadership. China's leadership is on par, and when you think about this, the reason for putting the local country leadership is to show that there's far more approval of international leadership than domestic leadership in virtually every single country there. To answer the question, is Sahel a homogeneous region? There are some common themes: high levels of food insecurity and poverty across the region. Religion is consistently perceived as important in daily life. However, support for Islamic principles as part of legislation varies quite a bit across the country, and in some countries, the momentum is shifting and changing. So important to keep a watch. Very high approval of US leadership across the region, which is very good for the kind of work that we're doing there, and especially as international broadcasters. Confidence in institutions is weak across the board, perhaps disproportionately in favor of military than the civilian governments in most countries, which means there is a need for independent, objective external media to provide accurate and objective information. Wide variation in democratic values, along with recent declines in perceived media freedom in some countries, underscores the critical mission of international broadcasters. Finally, the challenge that really is posed for international broadcasters, given the heterogeneity of ethnic groups and languages that they speak, that is a unique challenge that any broadcaster, including international broadcasters, have to deal with. Thank you. I'm going to turn over to my colleague Magali to talk about a few more deeper insights from the work we did in Mali, particularly. Chris, if you want to.
That I think is relevant for this group and, of course, for our broadcasting. The number of vernacular languages, the last point that Rajesh covered, I think is very significant. And if maybe just one quick second, Rajesh, if you would speak to the way the surveys were conducted and the need to conduct the surveys in multiple vernacular languages across the different markets in order to carry out the work. I think it might be of interest to this group.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as part of a regular process, we definitely try and capture at least 90 to 95% of the population that speak the local languages, which means in some countries it could be 3 to 4 languages that we would be translating all of our surveys into. And we go through a fairly elaborate process of verifying that, in fact, we are not missing out some of the important groups or the important languages. Our regional directors are responsible for ensuring that they get accurate information about it. In this particular region, we covered about 15 to 16 different languages, just covering those 7 countries that I've listed there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Rajesh. Our next presenter this morning is Ms. Magali Rolt. Magali is Gallup's Regional Research Director for Francophone Africa. In her current capacity, she manages all survey research operations, which include overseeing sample design, questionnaire translation processes, interviewer training, scheduling and budgeting. She also serves as a key liaison between Gallup and our local partners and US-based teams to ensure flawless and consistent execution of data collection efforts, which cover many hard-to-reach and volatile regions of the subcontinent. Ms. Rolt also provides expert advice on methodology and face-to-face interviewing techniques during in-country interviewer training sessions and fieldwork and observation. Her research interests focus on the intersection of governance, economic growth, and human development in sub-Saharan Africa. Her latest research paper explores the relationship between access to potable water and food security status of African households. Since joining Gallup in 2007, she has published more than 100 articles and analyses based on Gallup World Poll data, an ongoing global research initiative. Her research has appeared in many publications, including Harvard International Review and the Financial Times. Prior to joining Gallup, she worked as a researcher in the financial services industry. Before moving to the United States, she lived in France, where she studied urban development and land issues pertaining to the Maghreb and West Africa. She received a master's degree in urban planning from the University of Marseille and a master's degree in geography from the University of Avignon. She speaks English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Magali Rold.
Good morning. So my job is to focus, to provide the context from Mali in which to better understand the media usage data that you will see later on. So I too had a very cool map of the Sahel region, but for some reason it got cut in editing. And it was a really cool map because it really distilled all the things that are happening in the region, basically the Tuareg rebellions in the north in Mali and Niger, but also all the illegal trades that are happening that are using the old caravan routes to be funneling weapons, toxic waste. I was going to talk to you about Mokhtar Belmokhtar, also known as Mr. Marlboro, but I don't have the slide here, so I will dive straight into the methodology for Mali. So we have been doing since 2006, so since the launch of the World Poll, we have done 7 national surveys in Mali, and we interview people who are 15 and older, so we call them adults. So anyone over the age of 15 can qualify to be interviewed for the survey. Now, Mali, as many of you already know, is a very, very large country. It's about 500,000 miles. That's a big chunk of territory to cover. The borders are porous. It's really difficult to really know what's going on. In terms of geographic exclusions, in previous years, we were able to cover every single region in the country. But starting last year, we had to exclude, for obvious reasons, several regions. So which ones we excluded? They are Timbuktu, Kidal, Gao, and also the Mopti region. And the Mopti region is actually more of a buffer region between the north and the south. But when we did the survey last year, we did it in late October, early November, and by then it was becoming too unsafe to even field the questionnaire in that buffer region of Mopti. So that was also excluded. And if you look at the proportion of the population that those exclusions represent, it's about 25%. The sample size every year has been 1,000 people. And between 2006 and 2010, we did the surveys using paper and pencil. And then in 2011, we were able to move to doing CAPI studies. So our interviewers use PDAs to field the questionnaire, and we do add about a day and a half, 2 days of training to make sure everybody knows how to field, how to administer the questionnaire using PDAs. And just one last thing that I want to mention on 2 things, actually, on Mali. So we did the World Poll survey in 2012, end of October, early November, and the BBG Bamako survey was fielded just a few weeks later in early December. And the other thing I want to mention is in terms of the difficulties, the challenges of working in this region, so beyond getting government authorization to do the work, the difficulty in sending interviewers from one sampling point to another sampling point is mainly the challenge around recruiting female interviewers to be sent beyond the capital city. And that is in both Mali and Niger something that is a real challenge. So for this survey, we had about 36, the field staff was about total 36 people, and we only had 4 women. I want to talk to you a little bit about the trends over time in Mali, because I think that it really shows the power of the whirlpool. It's not just 1 or 2 data points in time, but it's having the ability to see how things are moving in the country and how perceptions and opinions can be changing based on what is happening in the country. And Mali had a good run in terms of stability. The government, the previous president was elected in elections that were deemed pretty much free and fair, and then he ran again, was re-elected, and he was going to step down last year. And I was actually in Cameroon when the coup happened in Mali. I was overseeing the interviewers training in Cameroon. Turn on the TV very early in the morning, and then you see that ATT was ousted. And that was very interesting because he was really stepping down. He had just a few weeks to go. So here, what we have seen in our data over time is that things have been moving up and down, but focusing on what happened between 2011 and 2012 in Mali. And we see that there has been a huge drop in institutional confidence. On this slide, I'm just showing you confidence in just 3 institutions: the national government, the judiciary, and the military. But if you look at all the other institutional confidence questions that we have, this is true across the board. And this is really unique to Mali. We had drops in institutional confidence in many other countries in the Sahel between 2011 and 2012. But Mali is the only country where institutional confidence dropped significantly for every single institution, including the military. Now, for those of us who know, who spend a lot of time working in this country and knowing about what's going on, it is actually not a great surprise that confidence in the military dropped so much, because the population probably perceived that their military could not keep them safe, considering what was happening in the north and how the rebels were making their way south relatively quickly. And then I wanted to include basically the timing of the coup. So we did in November 2011 the survey, then the coup happened in March, and then we went back to the field in Mali in November 2012. Pretty significant drops. Rajesh showed you this question about Islamic principles, Sharia, and what I wanted to focus on is the change between 2010 and 2012. So this is a question that we would call more of a value question. In other words, this is something that is very deep, that people have a strong attachment to, and we don't really expect big changes from here, just 2 years, but yet we do in Mali. So the question is, Sharia is an Arabic word which means Islam's religious principles. In general, which of these statements comes closest to your point of view? Sharia must be the only source of legislation. Sharia must be one of the sources of legislation. Sharia should not be a source of legislation. So in 2012, in 2010 actually, we saw that about 3 in 10 said that it should be the only source of legislation. That figure dropped fairly significantly to 13% just 2 years later. Now, this is 2010. We were able to do all of Mali. 2012, it's Mali minus those 4 regions. But I also look at the 2012 data, the 2010 data minus the 4 regions, and it's basically, instead of 29%, it would be 28%. So people in the north, what that means is that people in the north are not, at the time, they were not more likely to say that Sharia should be the only source of legislation. And the big shift happened really between the proportion of people who said that it should not be a source at all, just 13% in 2010, moving to over half 2 years later. This is actually from the Bamako Media Usage Survey. So in early December last year, we fielded 2,000 interviews in the capital city only. And we asked residents in the capital this question about what they thought were the top 3 most important issues that their country faced. And what you can see here is the Azawad. So Azawad is the territory that is claimed by the Tuareg populations in the north. That the territorial conflict related to that part of the country was by far what Malians had on their minds. Overtaking increases in food prices, which is pretty interesting because because of what was happening in the north, actually, there was an increase in food prices in the capital city. There were other issues related to having access to food and other major products. Another piece that I wanted to look at, since this is related to Azawad and how basically what the Tuaregs, what the populations in the north, what they have wanted, their quest for independence and acknowledgement of being different oftentimes has been conflated with what has been happening with the terrorist activities. So wanting to look at how Malians feel about acts of violence. So we have these 2 questions, and only a couple words are changed in the wording of the questions. And we say, some people think that for the military to target and kill civilians is sometimes justified, while others think that kind of violence is never justified. Which is your opinion? And as you can see, between 2010 and 2012, there was no change. And basically, a large proportion, a majority, reject this kind of violence that would engage the military to target and kill civilians. You change a few words in the question, and you, instead of asking about the military, you say an individual or a small group of people, whether targeting and killing civilians in this context is sometimes justified or never justified. And here you have a shift between, it's still a majority, but you have a shift between 2010 and 2012, where more people last year said that this type of violence was never justified. And those are statistically significant differences. again, in the context of what has been happening in North Mali, trying to better understand how Malians feel about the basic freedoms. So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and also freedom of assembly. And so we present them with this hypothetical situation where we ask them if they would have to write a new constitution for a new country. And we want to know whether this is a type of freedom that they would include in the constitution. So we see that we have very, very large proportions, basically overwhelmingly Malian support freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They also appear to support freedom of assembly, but there was a drop between 2010 and 2012. And the reason for this is basically the context, the safety, the security situation that was happening at the time we did the survey, where, again, remember, we have our groups of interviewers, and they move in basically small groups, 2, 3. They may be working with a supervisor, and at the time, that made people uncomfortable because they couldn't tell, the population couldn't tell, are these people, these small groups, who are they really? They're walking around with, they're gonna ask questions, and that made people uncomfortable. There was a lot of checkpoints, even in Bamako, at the time of the survey, where people were stopped and had to show their identity. So there was a lot of unease. So that, I believe, reflects what was happening at the time we fielded the survey. This is another slide that I wanted to incorporate in this presentation. This is from the Bamako study from last December in terms of trust as it relates to certain broadcasters. So we see that ORTM is the national broadcaster. Very, very high levels of trust among Bamako residents. Radio Clédou, which is a VOA affiliate, is also enjoys fairly large levels of trust. And then VOA at 87% also has fairly large, widespread trust among Bamako residents. So we see that we have a very fast-moving environment in the country. There are lots and lots of things happening in Mali, and from the 2 studies that we have, the Whirlpool as well as the media usage study, we know that there is a need for Malians and Bamako residents to find out what is really happening and to have access to objective and trustworthy information about what's happening in their country and also what's happening in the sub-region. And it is, of course, very important to cover a variety of topics. I had another slide, too, that got cut that showed what people are interested in. And so, yes, religion was at the top of the list, but there was also a great deal of interest in issues of education, healthcare, politics. So it's important to cover a wide variety of themes that affect Malians personally. Talking about languages, Rajesh touched a little bit on this. I can tell you that in Mali we use Bambara, which is it's based by far the language that is used the most to field about 90% of the surveys. The other language that we use in Mali is French. This year, when in a few weeks we're going back to Mali, and this time we'll do all the Bamako and the other 4 regions in the south, and we'll be using, in addition to Bambara and French, Fulani and Songhai. However, we do see that you do need to have other languages if you want to touch some other parts of the country, and that is true in other countries in the Sahel. Rajesh showed you about a very high approval of U.S. leadership. If you combine this with a very high trust ratings of not only the national broadcaster, but also the VOA affiliate Radio Clédou and BBG has signed an agreement with ORTM to provide this new 24/7 service. We believe that all this combined positions the VOA broadcaster very well to do this type of work in the capital city and also to extend it to the rest of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magali. Bruce, any comments on your new partnership in Mali?
Well, I'll tell you, I would just mention that all the way around, and this is something that Governor may also refer to, the BBG, Voice of America, stepped up our presence in Mali considerably over the last year, inaugurating a new FM station in Bamako in January, adding to our affiliations across the country with Clédou, with the National Radio and Television Authority. So very substantial increase in our footprint in the country that we look to strengthen even further in the ways in which we've just discussed with the vernacular language and Bambara and so forth. So it's been very active in the last year.
Thanks, Bruce. I forgot to mention when we began this morning that the presentations, we're also videotaping this. These will be hung on the BBG site in the next day or two. You'll also have some of that on the Gallup website as well. So if you're fast and furiously taking notes, these presentations will be available in the next couple days online. Our next presenter this morning is Mr. William Bell, the Director of Research for the International Broadcasting Bureau. Bill Bell oversees all audience research activities for the Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. He founded IBB's Audience Research Department and now leads a team of research professionals managing more than 70 projects a year worldwide. Prior to assuming this position, he served as Deputy Director of Affiliate Relations for VOA and as Deputy Policy Manager for the former U.S. Information Agency's WorldNet satellite TV service. He began his career as a Foreign Service Officer, serving as Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Cameroon and as Deputy Public Affairs Officer in New Zealand. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the Fletcher School of Public Diplomacy and in survey methodology from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bell Bell.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, all. I'm going to speak to you more about media issues, moving from the attitudinal topics that the previous speakers have spoken about. And I'll be discussing two interesting environments in the Sahel region, Mali and Somalia. Unfortunately, we don't have good opinion data yet on Somalia. As I understand it, Gallup hasn't been able yet to do a national world poll there. Hopefully, the next time we have one of these meetings, there'll be more to report on the opinion front from that country. So we'll be speaking purely about the media scene there. So let me start with Mali. And the data I'll be presenting this morning comes from the survey of Bamako that was referenced in the earlier presentations conducted last December. And there are two cautionary points to bear in mind. The first is that Bamako is the capital. It's not Mali as a whole. As in all African countries, the capital cities are quite different with respect to media use and many other topics. So don't project this information to all of Mali. Within the capital, access to broadcast platforms is very, very widespread, television and radio, as is the case with mobile phones. But unlike many African capitals, access to new media is pretty low in Bamako right now. There's a very, very strong correlation in terms of media consumption patterns between language spoken by the individual and in the household, and we'll speak more about that in just a moment, and demographics also have a strong impact on actual media choices among Bamako residents. So here's some hard data on actual access to media platforms in the typical household in Bamako. You can see that access to TV and radio is almost universal. Almost every household has a mobile phone now in the capital, but computers and internet access is much, much lower. These figures are substantially below what we see in more developed African capitals. And we see a similar pattern when we look at the use of different platforms for news. We've done here sort of a crude segmentation analysis. On the one hand, of course, looking at the total population represented in the tan bars, French speakers who would tend to be more upscale, a little bit more elite in this environment, and then uneducated women as a kind of a proxy measure of the more marginalized populations in the country. And you can see some interesting contrasts in the platforms to which these different groups turn for news on a daily basis. And when one gets into the digital platforms, SMS, internet, you can see almost no usage of these platforms by the more marginalized group, higher use among the French speakers. So bear in mind, thinking about communications, one needs to think about the platforms different demographic segments of the population are using in order to reach them. So we'll talk about language for a moment. We speak rather loosely of Francophone Africa, but the fact of the matter is that the majority of the populations of these countries don't speak French or don't speak it well enough to easily understand a radio or television broadcast in French. And as a result, there's a notable difference in media use between French speakers and non-French speakers for two reasons. One, knowledge of French is obviously more correlated both with education and higher socioeconomic status. And therefore, French speakers both have access to a wider range of media platforms, perhaps internet, perhaps satellite TV. And of course, since they speak French, there are many more channels that they can understand and benefit from. So for those two reasons, French speakers have access to a much wider range of content, of media platforms. On the other hand, if we want to reach the more rural, the more marginalized portions of the population, it's absolutely essential that we get into the local languages for broadcasting purposes, as we've done in Mali with Bambara and Songhai in the north, I might add. And you can see even a matter as simple as trying to reach female audiences, language really matters. In Bamako, you can see here that the percentage of males who understand French well enough to listen to a radio broadcast is twice as high as is the case for females in that city. But interestingly, when we ask people what language they prefer to use to listen to the radio, even among French speakers, there's a slight preference for Bambara. And bear in mind, again, this is Bamako, the capital city. So, of course, this would be much, much stronger elsewhere in the country and possibly other languages as well. And, of course, for the population as a whole, 3/4 say they prefer Bambara for listening to radio broadcasts. So moving into Bambara was clearly a wise move for our organization. There's still strong usage of external media in Mali, as is the case in many African countries. And by external media, I mean international broadcasters like BBC, like Radio France International, VOA, of course. And as in most Francophone environments, I should say Francophone in quotes, the French radio and TV broadcasters do dominate audiences, both because of the extent of their broadcast, the number of hours in the day, and the degree to which they cover the region. But their audience is limited by language knowledge. And if we're looking, once again, at other segments of the population aside from French speakers, it's, of course, more difficult to reach those. So here's some data specifically looking at individual broadcast outlets. And you can see while the national broadcast to ORTM is at the top of the list in terms of past week audiences, the two French services, TV5 and France 24, have very, very high audiences, of course, especially among French speakers, but even among the population as a whole, they do quite well. Pretty high access to these broadcasters in Bamako. This would not be the case, by the way, elsewhere in Mali, where access to satellite TV and MMDS and other means of distribution are less prevalent. Looking at radio, we see a similar phenomenon. RFI, the French broadcaster, does extremely well, as is the case in other Francophone countries, with ORTM still at the top of the list. And you can see VOA here. I would caution that the number of VOA was collected in this survey in December last year. This was prior to the inauguration of our FM in Bamako and prior to the introduction of our Bambara service. So based on that and other data that we have, we think the audience of VOA is actually quite a bit larger than this in Mali now. Similar patterns, we asked about most important news sources. The national broadcasters at the top of the list. Among French speakers, France 24 does pretty well as a station relied on for news. As I mentioned earlier, digital media or new media is much less prevalent in Bamako than in other African capitals. There are language issues. To the extent people are using the internet, primarily going on Facebook and using search engines to look for information. And the mobile web phenomenon that we've seen elsewhere in African urban environments is less prevalent in Bamako. Just some data here on weekly use of the internet, pretty low figures even among French speakers. And if we look at what people do on their mobile phones, a lot of SMS, of course voice calls, a lot of radio listening on mobiles, which is quite common in the region, but much less use of mobiles for more advanced functions like accessing the web, email, mobile apps, and so on. So still a relatively basic environment with respect to mobile. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least touch on some of the additional research we've done since December. This is somewhat unconventional research using some more experimental methodologies. But we've tried to track some of the changes both in the local environment, politically in terms of media, and in terms of our own broadcasting strategy, as I mentioned earlier. So we did in May, at the request of our African division, specifically our African division chief Gwendillers, who's sitting back there, a small micro poll in Bamako just to get some reactions to the introduction of the new Bambara program, just 120 respondents. And we got some interesting data out of that. We found that almost everybody was tuning in on FM, mostly via our dedicated frequency there, but also via our affiliate, Radio Cladou, a very important station for us. Interestingly, almost no audience on shortwave, almost no audience via mobile or on the web. Very, very positive reactions we had to the Bambara service, the Bambara programming, as well as our focus on news, specifically from Mali. One of our respondents said, hearing Bambara from the U.S. makes me proud. You can imagine what that's like for a Mali resident to hear his language on an American radio station. We also did an interesting study, again, experimental, using mobile phones and internet voice recognition methodology in September, just to try to get additional kind of reading of what was going on in the country. We were able to contact 602 respondents. They could have been from anywhere in Mali, so this actually was not confined just to Bamako, although we don't have the actual geographic distribution. But we were interested to note that the audience was about equally divided between French speakers and Bambara speakers, so the Bambara is doing well for us. And as we found in the Bamako study, about half were listening on FM, divided between the dedicated service and the affiliate, and about a quarter were on shortwave. Interestingly, we found a significant number of people saying they were using the internet to tune in, which definitely requires some further investigation. That's not something we would have expected given other data about the paucity of internet access. So if we're thinking about communicating with Malians, don't forget the importance of local language. Broadcast media is clearly the way to go right now on a national basis. We need to be on radio, and digital is still mostly a niche phenomenon. So let's move through to Somalia very quickly. When we started doing research in Somalia a couple of years ago, we found unexpectedly high levels of internet access, satellite TV, mobile phones, and so on. We thought this has to be a mistake. Somalia is a war-torn, chaotic country. It can't be true. We kept doing research, and we found the same thing over and over again. And so we finally concluded that, in fact, it was true. It is actually quite a sophisticated environment with respect to alternative media sources. Why is this? Well, there's a very large Somali diaspora that funnels a lot of money back into the country, as well as media access equipment has also been instrumental in setting up websites, TV stations, cable stations, and so on. Secondly, there's been no effective national government in Mali for many years. So it's an interesting test case of what happens when you have a totally free market. There's no regulation, and hence telecom sector, which thrives even in the most poverty-stricken environments, could grow without any government interference. And so it's actually been a very, very active mobile sector in particular in Mali for a long time now. So you can see here comparing media access in Mali to other countries in the region. Radio and TV obviously quite high, but if you look on the right at computers, internet, and satellite, you see higher rates of access than even Kenya, much less other less prosperous countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania. The same is true when you look at media platforms used for news. Radio does dominate, as is the case throughout the continent, but internet is pretty high here. 19% of Somalis saying they use internet on a daily basis for news, which you shall see in the next slide, is about the highest anywhere in Africa. Here's a list of all the countries for which we have this particular data point. These are percentages of the population using the internet on a daily basis for news. Somalia's at the top of the list, right there with South Africa. And the same is true if one looks at personal ownership of mobile phones. Again, Somalia's at the top of the list. So this is a unexpectedly sophisticated environment with respect to access to alternative media sources. At the same time, even though they're quite sophisticated technologically, that doesn't mean there's good quality journalism. And I think we all know the reasons why that's the case. Somalia is one of the most dangerous countries in the world in which to be a journalist. Many journalists have been killed and otherwise silenced in Somalia. So that fact, coupled with the access to lots of technology for media access, creates a major role for international broadcasters like the Voice of America and others. And you can see here some of the actual audience figures for major broadcasters. About half of Somali adults are relying on VOA now for news and information on a weekly basis in that country, higher than anyone else except our main companion station, who is not identified here for reasons of discretion. Some of you may know who that is. But we're both higher than any of the other local stations mentioned on this slide. So very, very heavy reliance on the international broadcasters in Somali for news. There's some interesting regional differences. I think was mentioned earlier, this was the first national survey of Somalia. So we covered Somaliland, Puntland in the middle, and then south-central Somalia in the south, and saw some major differences there. Most significantly, Puntland is a huge market for international broadcasters in particular, much less access to local media. There's much less local media in general in Puntland, whereas in other parts of the country, the picture was different. You can see in south-central Somalia, represented in dark green, if those colors came through, there's pretty large audiences for local stations like Radio Shabelle and Radio Mogadishu, but even there, still big audiences for the international stations. And if we look at most important news sources, again, the international stations are at the top of the list. So just to reiterate this point, when we ask Somalis, who's your most important news source, international radio stations are at the absolute top. So we do play a vital role in this country. I won't dwell on these regional distinctions. I touched on that earlier in the interest of time. And again, media ownership varies by region, as I mentioned. So we'll just skip through here to a bit about new media use. As I said earlier, internet use is quite high in Somalia relative to other African countries. Facebook is used by almost everybody who goes on the web, both for the usual social networking purposes and as an information source. And there are a very large number of internet sites in Somali putting out news information, many sponsored by expats and other journalists. So there's a lot of access to news information on the web available in Somali. And mobile is used a lot now for internet and other non-traditional activities. So when we ask people specifically about the internet and what sites they go to for news, Facebook and Google are at the top of the list. This is not uncommon in many countries, but you can see pretty significant usage of some of these other sites as well with Somali language broadcast or content. And if we look at mobile phones, a remarkable third of mobile phone owners say they access the internet on mobiles. This is a very high figure for Africa. So there's a lot of potential using that methodology. High levels of radio listening via mobiles, as we saw in Somalia and Mali as well. So if we're thinking about a communication strategy to reach Somalis, we need to bear in mind that the role of international stations like VOA and others remains extremely important. radio is still the most widely used news medium across all regions, but more so in some than in others. But there are opportunities that we didn't see so much in Mali, but we do see in Somalia for usage of alternative platforms, whether it's web, mobile phones, or so on. And the payoff from those can happen a lot sooner than may be the case in other African environments. So that wraps it up. Turn it back to my colleagues for further comments.
Let's give a nice round of applause to our presenters. We've got about 15, 20 minutes for questions, and we've got roving mics. So if you just raise your hand if you've got questions, and one of my colleagues will bring a mic to you. If you'd introduce yourself and let us know what organization you're from, that'd be great.
Just want to pick up on something Bill noted. He recognized here with us today as Gwen Dillard, who's the head of the Africa Division at the Voice of America. Steve Reddish is the executive editor of VOA, just behind Gwen, and there are colleagues also from Voice of America. Jeremy Croce's here, Stephen Ferry's here from the Africa Division. I single out our VOA colleagues because this is the kind of information to convey to all of you that we share with them. This is for the purposes of informing our broadcasting, our strategies, how we can understand markets and reach audiences. So we're aggregating the wealth of information that we gather through our research activities and trying to crystallize the principal findings to help inform these strategies. And I would just say that I'm not sure that a member of our board, Governor Meehan, will be able to join us. He did mention that one of his children was not feeling well this morning, so he might not be here. And I just want to stress 2 points that I think he was going to make. One is, well, in fact, I think he's outside, so I'll let him stress those when he gets in. We can just go right to the Q&A. Why don't we let Michael comment the very, maybe join us in a wrap-up, Steve, Chris. That make sense?
That's perfect.
Hi, my name is D'Amica Williams. I'm from D3 Systems in McLean. My question is for Magali. I know that you had mentioned that your field staff only had 4 women, and I was wondering how that affected the gender distribution of your sample, or if it affected it.
So we don't do gender matching in Mali, okay? So it's basically, it's more of a cultural issue where I can give you one example that was from Niger a couple of years ago, where we also had very few women. We had trained everyone, and then it was right before we were planning for field work. And the next day, when everybody came back, one of the young women said that her parents didn't want her to be traveling outside of Niamey, outside of the capital city. So we had to rejigger, who was gonna go where, and she ended up doing interviews only in the capital city. But I don't think it's affecting, the gender distribution in terms of the random selection of the respondent, and we don't do gender matching anyway.
Good morning. Stephen Ferry, VOA Africa. I have a question about the Sahel region, and it has to do with folks in the Sahel region and just north of it who are Arabs or who self-identify as being Arab, and their relationship with sub-Saharan Africans. Has your research revealed anything in terms of if there's possibly a level of conflict there, or cooperation, how religion plays out? That's basically the question.
So there are Arabs definitely living in the Sahel region, but that would be a smaller proportion of other groups. We did have a question last year in 2012 about markers of identity. So we weren't asking people to say what they preferred, but we would give them one marker, for example, their ethnic group, and how strongly they identified with that particular identity marker. Another marker was Africa as the continent. But we didn't have their own ethnic information, so we couldn't cross-reference that. So unfortunately, we have some of the pieces of this puzzle that you're posing, but we don't have all the elements. And in some countries, ethnicity in that part of the continent, it can be a very touchy question. Like I'm thinking of Mauritania, for example.
Absolutely. Can I mention one data point? It has to do with Somalia that may be of interest, is that I think for the past, two or 3 years now, we've had about 300 to 330,000 SMS subscribers in Somalia, getting 2 text messages a day. So it just sort of underscores some of the data that Bill mentioned.
Gwen Dillard from the Voice of America. I have 2 questions, perhaps for Bill Bell. The first one has to do with traditional languages, and you mentioned the importance of that. We do know that our Bambara broadcasting seems to be very popular, but we do also provide content in Songhai, and we don't have a good sense of how important that is or how large the audience is that listens uniquely in Songhai and not any other language. And then the second question, also regarding Mali, is do you have any information on people who are listening to radio programs via mobile devices?
Sorry, well, I didn't catch the tail end of your second question.
Question about people who may be listening to radio programs through their mobile devices in Mali.
Through their mobile devices. Okay. On the first question, as I understand it, Songhai is spoken primarily in the north, and for reasons referred to earlier by Rajesh and Magali, it's not been possible to survey there, so it's going to be difficult to get that information. We are planning a new quasi-national survey, I think it's fair to say, with our partners at Gallup. Whether you'll be able to get into the Songhai-speaking regions, I don't know. What's your take on that?
Songhai there have been some data from other groups about the language distribution in the country. So it's not like you would get 30% or 40% of people in the country speaking Songhai. Bambara has become really a language. It's definitely spoken in the south and in the capital city. But it has become what we call a vehicular language. So a lot of people who are not of Bambara origin have adopted Bambara as their lingua franca, so to speak. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important to have Songhai or Fulani or other languages, but Bambara would cover a significant proportion of the audience in Mali. And we'll try to get, as much data as we can about linguistic barriers and any linguistic data that we can collect, where we're going to be going, which will still exclude Tombouctou, Gao, Kidal, and Mopti this year.
So we'll ask about Songhai, of course, in the upcoming survey, but whether we'll in fact capture the majority of the Songhai-speaking population is yet unknown. With respect to your second question, there's quite substantial listening to radio via mobile devices. Primarily that means using the embedded FM chips in most mobile phones these days to use a mobile essentially as a radio. It means you have to have an FM signal, obviously, to get there. Very little listening, as far as we can determine, using a mobile to actually stream audio on the web. It's just not technically feasible in most African environments and expensive to do that. But mobiles as radios are very, very common now.
Next question. Okay. We're very fortunate to have with us this morning a board member from the Broadcasting Board of Governors. For those of you that aren't aware of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, it's both the name of the independent federal agency that covers all U.S. civilian international media and the name of the board that governs those broadcasts. The board is composed of 9 members with expertise in the fields of mass communications, broadcast media, or international affairs. 8 members are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The 9th, the Secretary of State, serves as ex officio. With us this morning is Mr. Michael Meehan, who spent 23 years working in U.S. Congress, congressional and presidential campaigns. For the past 6 years, has built a successful communications strategy and public relations firm, Vin Squared Communications. As president and CEO, Meehan's firm provides strategic communications for dozens of Fortune 500 companies, foundations, trade associations, and political and issue campaigns. On Capitol Hill, Meehan has served in senior roles for U.S. Senator John Kerry, Barbara Boxer, Maria Cantwell, and former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, as well as Congressman Vic Fazio and John Oliver. Meehan serves as a member of the Advisory Committee and the Special Committee on the Future of Shortwave Broadcasting. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Meehan.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sorry to be late. My youngest was not well this morning and insisted Daddy take care of her. So given that I missed many of those days in my time on Capitol Hill, I figured it was better to come and close the remarks here than to open them. But Bruce had shared with me the PowerPoints. I'm sad I missed some of the Q&A. But you know, the board is dedicated to having open and transparent. This is taxpayer-funded polling. I'm glad you all are here. Thank you for your interest. One of the reasons why we want to do these things and we're committed to doing them is not only, do we have new information, but you have lots of information that help us achieve our missions. It's great to see many of my BBG, Voice of America, and other colleagues here today participating in this. But I mean, we have such limited funds and limited ability to do these things that we really have to leverage each other's talents in order to achieve our mission. So I want to just thank you all for being here. Thank Gallup for being great partners on this. One of my previous jobs that Chris didn't mention, because I can't keep a job, is I used to run the polling for the Democratic Party. So I've had a very strong personal interest in the research. You know, we make millions of dollars of decisions on very little research. I wish we had a bigger budget, but we're fighting to maximize the dollars that we do have so we can achieve this. And I think Mali is one of the areas where we're able to use research, whereas I'm sure you were told today about the predominance of Bambara, and we're able to leverage some of those assets with the Defense Department to stand up new radio stations in Mali, just as the peak of in our efforts to help counter some of the violent extremism that's rising in the region. So thank you all for being here today. Hopefully you'll continue to engage with us on this topic in these countries and in others as well, because it's not an easy task. We are shorthanded, so we need to use all the resources that we have. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Michael. We are adjourned, but I do want to once again plug the December 11th event on Vietnam. We're still deciding what we're going to do in January, but by the December 11th event, we'll be able to share that with you. Also, you can find the link up above on where the video as well as the PowerPoint presentations from today will be posted. Again, thank you for joining us.